The entire town came to a halt. Something unbelievable was happening. A wild Mustang had been missing for 3 days, and when they finally found him, no one could believe where he was, trapped in a deep concrete well with no food or water. His life was hanging by a thread. The town's people gathered, desperate to save him, but every attempt seemed to fail, and then something shocking happened. What unfolded that day touched everyone's hearts and changed this Mustang's life forever. The sun hung low over the quiet town, casting long shadows across the dry earth. It had been 3 days since anyone had seen the Mustang. He wasn't just any horse, he was a wild stallion known for roaming the outskirts of town, running free through the open fields. Some called him Spirit, others simply referred to him as the ghost horse, a legend among the locals. But now he was gone. It was Daniel Carter, a local ranch, who first noticed something was wrong. As he walked along the dirt road near his property, he stopped suddenly. A faint, strange sound reached his ears, a weak, muffled neigh, barely audible. His brow furrowed. The sound was coming from somewhere underground. Daniel followed the noise carefully, his boots kicking up dust as he walked toward an old, abandoned construction site at the edge of town. The site had been left unfinished for years, with several deep concrete wells dug for underground piping. He felt his pulse quicken. Rushing forward, he looked down into one of the wells, and his breath caught in his throat. There, trapped at the bottom of the narrow hole, lay the missing Mustang. The stallion's large, exhausted eyes met his once powerful body was covered in dirt, his legs scraped and bloody from desperate attempts to escape. He had been down there for days with no food, no water, and no way out. Daniel's heart pounded. He had to act fast. Without a second thought, he grabbed his phone and called the only person he knew could help, Mike Reynolds, the town's best horse wrangler. "Mike, we've got a situation," Daniel said urgently. "The Mustang, he's alive, but he's trapped in a well." A pause. Then Mike's voice came through, sharp and serious. "Where are you?" Daniel gave him the location. "Hurry, I don't know how much longer he can last." Mike didn't ask questions. Within minutes, the town's rescue team was mobilizing. Soon a group of farmers, ranchers, and volunteers arrived at the scene. More than a dozen people gathered, their faces filled with concern as they peered into the deep, narrow pit. The Mustang lay still, his body heaving with exhaustion. His legs were tangled awkwardly, and it was clear he didn't have much time left. The question hung in the air, unspoken but heavy with tension. How were they going to get him out? Daniel turned to Mike. "You ever seen anything like this?" Mike shook his head. "No, and if we don't act fast, he's not getting out alive." They had to come up with a plan, and fast, because the clock was ticking and the Mustang's life was slipping away with every passing second. The air was thick with tension. The Mustang lay trapped at the bottom of the well, his breath slow and labored. His once majestic coat was covered in dust and dried sweat, his legs red raw from struggling against the cold concrete walls. Every now and then a weak sound escaped his throat, a desperate call that had gone unheard for days. Mike paced near the edge of the well, his face tense. "We need a plan, and we need it now." Daniel nodded. "We can't just pull him up like any livestock. He's too big, and if we don't do it right, we could injure him even more." The small crowd that had gathered exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't just any horse. It was a Mustang, a wild stallion. Any wrong move could send him into a panic, and in his weakened state, that could mean the end. One of the ranchers, an older man named Frank, adjusted his hat. "I've seen cattle pulled out of pits before, but nothing this deep. We're going to need equipment." Mike nodded. "We have straps in a harness back at the ranch, but we need something big to lift him out." "A tractor, a crane." Daniel cut in. "The county has a construction crane sitting at the other end of town, if we can get permission to use it." Mike was already reaching for his phone. "I'll make the call." As Mike stepped away to arrange the crane, Daniel knelt near the well's opening. He could barely see the Mustang's chest rising and falling. The stallion's ears twitched slightly, but his head remained limp against the dirt. Lisa, the town's only veterinarian, arrived minutes later. She pushed through the crowd carrying a first aid kit. Her eyes widened as she looked down into the well. "Oh my God!" Daniel gestured for her to come closer. "He's still breathing, but he's in bad shape." "What do you think?" Lisa's brow furrowed. "He's dehydrated, exhausted, and probably in shock. If we Can't get him out soon, his body might shut down. She opened her bag and pulled out a syringe. I need to get fluids into him before we even attempt to move him. She carefully lowered a saline 4 bag into the well, attaching it to a long tube. The crowd watched in silence as the fluid began dripping into the Mustang's bloodstream. It wasn't much, but it was something. A few minutes later, Mike returned, his face a mixture of relief and urgency. We got the crane there, sending it over. Now the tension eased slightly, but no one dared to celebrate. Yet as they waited, Lisa continued monitoring the Mustang. After about 20 minutes, the stallion's breathing became steadier, his ears twitched a little more, and when Lisa called softly to him, his dark eyes slowly opened. The crowd gasped. For the first time since they had found him, the Mustang was fully awake. Lisa's voice was calm. Hey big guy, you're going to be okay. The Mustang blinked slowly, his gaze shifting between the people above him. He didn't thrash, didn't panic. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe somehow he understood that they were trying to help. The rumble of a heavy engine broke the silence. The crane had arrived. The rescue team worked fast, securing heavy duty straps to a harness. The plan was simple but dangerous. Lower the harness, get it around the Mustang, and slowly lift him to safety. But as they lowered the straps, something unexpected happened. The Mustang tried to stand. Lisa inhaled sharply. He's moving. The stallion's muscles tensed, his legs shaking as he attempted to push himself up, but after days of dehydration and exhaust, his body wasn't ready. He collapsed back down, a weak grunt escaping his throat. Daniel clenched his fists. We're running out of time. Mike adjusted the straps, his voice firm. We lift him now. The crane operator gave a thumbs up. The straps tightened around the Mustang's body. Everyone held their breath, and then the lift began. The Mustang's body rose slowly from the well, his legs dangling weakly beneath him. The crowd fell silent as the horse that had been trapped for 3 days was finally being pulled to safety. But just as they thought they had him, something went terribly wrong. The Mustang suddenly jerked. His instincts kicked in, and he started thrashing. Midair, the strap shifted. The crane swayed slightly. Lisa's voice rang out, panic creeping into her tone. Hold him steady, he's panicking, Mike shouted at the crane operator. Lower him back down slowly. But the Mustang's movements were getting wilder. If they couldn't calm him, he could fall. The rescue that had seemed so close to success had just turned into a life or death situation. The Mustang thrashed violently, his powerful body twisting in midair as the crane lifted him higher. The straps that had been carefully secured around him now strained under the weight of his wild movements. The crowd gasped as the crane swayed dangerously, struggling to keep balance against the sudden resistance. Lisa's heart pounded. If he keeps this up, he's going to break free. Mike clenched his fists. We have to calm him down now. Daniel grabbed a long rope and rushed closer to the Mustang, his boots kicking up dust as he moved. His voice was firm but steady. Easy boy, we're here to help. But the Mustang wasn't listening. Instinct had taken over. He wasn't thinking, he was fighting for survival. A loud snap echoed through the air. One of the side straps jerked loose, sending the Mustang's body tilting dangerously. The crowd screamed. Mike yelled to the crane operator, get him down, lower him now. The operator reacted instantly, easing the controls to bring the Mustang back toward the ground, but it wasn't fast enough. The Mustang kicked out wildly, his hooves narrowly missing the concrete edge of the well. Daniel took a risk. He stepped forward directly into the Mustang's line of sight. Spirit, look at me. For a split second, everything froze. The Mustang's wild eyes locked onto Daniel's. The tension in his body didn't disappear, but something changed. Recognition. Daniel took another step, keeping his voice low. That's right, you know me, you've seen me before. Lisa barely breathed. Is he listening? Mike didn't blink. Keep going. The Mustang snorted loudly, his nostrils flaring as he tried to make sense of what was happening. He was still dangling, still vulnerable, but for the first time he wasn't panicking. Daniel reached out, gripping the side of the strap closest to him. His fingers were shaking, but he held firm. You're okay, we're not letting you fall. The Mustang stopped thrashing. His breaths were still fast, his muscles still trembling, but he wasn't fighting anymore. The crane operator took the chance. He lowered the Mustang slowly, carefully, inch by inch. The moment his Hoops touched solid ground. The crowd let out a collective breath. Lisa rushed forward with a damp cloth, wiping the dust from the Mustang's eyes. You did it, she whispered. You're safe now. The Mustang didn't run. He stood there, legs shaking, eyes scanning the faces around him. Mike turned to Daniel. That was the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Daniel chuckled breathlessly. Yeah, but it worked. Lisa checked the stallion's vitals. He's dehydrated and exhausted, but his heart rate is slowing down. He's going to make it. The entire town erupted in cheers. They had done it. They had saved him. But as the dust settled and the adrenaline faded, one question remained. Where would he go now? The Mustang had no herd, no home, and though he was free, he was completely alone. The Mustang stood motionless, his legs trembling beneath him as if his body was unsure whether to collapse or run. The crane had done his job. He was finally free, but something wasn't right. The crowd that had gathered erupted in cheers, but the Mustang didn't move. He didn't bolt, didn't rear up, didn't even shake the dust from his coat. He just stood there. Lisa knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his sweat-streaked shoulder. He's in shock, she said softly. He doesn't even realize he's out. Daniel took a step closer, watching the stallion carefully. He had expected the Mustang to take off the moment his hooves touched solid ground, to vanish over the hills the way wild horses always did, but instead he was frozen. Mike frowned. I don't like this. It's like he doesn't know what to do. Daniel's jaw tightened because he doesn't. The Mustang had spent 3 days trapped in darkness, alone, weak, terrified. His instincts should have told him to run, but he had nowhere to go. Lisa ran her hands over his legs, checking the deep scrapes from where he had fought against the concrete walls. He's hurt. If we let him go now, there's no guarantee he'll survive. Mike adjusted his hat. So what do? We can't just keep him. Daniel didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed locked on the Mustang's wild, dark, intelligent. He knew this horse. He had seen him countless times before, running across the plains at sunset, strong and free. The idea of letting him back out into the wild felt right, but the idea of letting him go like this, injured, exhausted, vulnerable, felt wrong. The murmuring of the crowd filled the silence. One of the farmers crossed his arms. If he can't make it on his own, he'll need someone to take him in. Lisa shook her head. He's a wild Mustang. He's never been owned, never been ridden. Taming him would be nearly impossible. Daniel exhaled slowly. He doesn't need to be tamed. He just needs time. Mike raised an eyebrow. And where exactly is he supposed to get that? Daniel looked at him, then back at the Mustang, and he knew the ranch wasn't far. Daniel had enough land, enough space. If the Mustang needed a place to heal, he could stay there. Not forever, not as a pet, just until he was strong enough to go back to where he belonged. But taming a wild horse, even temporarily, was dangerous. Mike ran a hand down his face. You do realize what you're signing up for, right? Daniel nodded. I do. Lisa smiled. Then let's get him home. Getting the Mustang to the ranch wasn't easy. He was exhausted, too weak to fight, but still carried enough fear in his eyes to warn them not to push him too hard. Instead of forcing him into a trailer, Daniel and Lisa decided to do it slowly. They set up a temporary pen near the rescue site, giving him a few hours to regain his strength. Lisa kept a bucket of water close, letting him drink when he was ready. We can't rush him, she murmured. The last thing we need is for him to panic and injure himself more. The Mustang drank slowly, his ears flicking toward every sound. He was still in survival mode, still unsure of what to do, but he was watching Daniel, watching Lisa, watching the people who had saved him. He wasn't running, and that was something. By nightfall, the Mustang was ready to move. Daniel led the way, keeping his pace steady as they walked toward the trailer. Mike stood nearby, ready to intervene if things went wrong. The Mustang hesitated at the entrance for a moment. It seemed like he would refuse. Then slowly he stepped inside the crowd. Let out of breath, Mike smirked. Well, would you look at that? Seems like he trusts you. Daniel didn't reply because, as he looked at the Mustang standing in the trailer, he realized something. This horse, the one who should have run the moment he was free, had made a choice, and for now that choice was to stay. The road back to the ranch was long and quiet. The Mustang stood in the trailer, his body swaying slightly with the movement of the truck. He didn't fight, didn't panic, just stood there, his ears flicking at Every sound his eyes alert but calm. Daniel glanced in the side mirror, watching the dust curl behind them as they drove. He had transported horses before, but this felt different. There was no halter, no lead rope, no force keeping the Mustang inside. He was here because he had chosen to be. Lisa sat beside Daniel, stealing glances back at the trailer. I still can't believe he walked in like that. Mike, sitting in the passenger seat, scoffed. You think that means he's tame? Just wait the second we let him out, Hune probably take off. Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. He wasn't trying to tame the Mustang, he just wanted to give him a chance. The truck rolled to a stop as they reached the ranch. The sky had darkened, the last slivers of daylight fading behind the hills. The air was cool, carrying the distant sounds of cattle in the pastures and the rustling of the wind through the trees. Daniel climbed out first, stepping toward the trailer. The Mustang shifted inside, his hooves clinking softly against the metal floor. Lisa approached cautiously. How do you want to do this? Daniel thought for a moment. We opened the gate and let him decide. Mike raised an eyebrow. That's your plan? Daniel nodded. No ropes, no pressure, just see what he does. Lisa exhaled. All right, Mike muttered. This is either going to be real smart or real stupid. Daniel unlatched the trailer door and stepped back for a long moment. Nothing happened. The Mustang remained inside, his shadow barely visible against the dim light. He sniffed the air, his ears flicking toward the open space in front of him. The ranch stretched out beyond the fence. His chance to run was right there, but he didn't move. The second stretched on. The wind carried the scent of the open land, but the Mustang just stood there staring. Then finally he took one step forward, then another, and just like that he was out. But he didn't run. The Mustang walked slowly, his head turning toward the open pasture, then back toward the people who had freed him. His eyes scanned the land, his body tense with uncertainty. Mike crossed his arms. Well, he ain't bolting. Lisa smiled. Maybe Hune's curious. Daniel took a slow step forward, stopping a few feet away. The Mustang's ears perked, his muscles shifting as if debating whether to stay or flee. Daniel lowered his gaze, keeping his posture relaxed. Your choice, big guy. The Mustang exhaled sharply, dust swirling around his nostrils. Then, without warning, he ran. The crowd flinched as he took off, his hooves pounding against the earth. The power and his stride sent dirt flying behind him as he galloped toward the open field. Lisa's breath caught. There he goes, Mike sighed. Told you. But Daniel wasn't watching the Mustang disappear because the stallion didn't go far. Instead of vanishing into the night, he stopped near the fence line. His silhouette stood against the moonlight, his man lifting in the wind. He turned his head, looking back. Lisa's voice was barely a whisper. He's watching us. Mike frowned. What's he waiting for? Daniel swallowed hard. He didn't know the answer. The Mustang stood still for another moment, then just as suddenly as he had stopped, he turned and disappeared into the darkness. Lisa exhaled. Guess that's that. Mike clapped a hand on Daniel's shoulder. You gave him a chance, that's all you could do. Daniel nodded. Yeah, but as he stared into the empty night, he couldn't shake the feeling this wasn't over, and deep down he knew the Mustang would come back. The night passed in silence. The Mustang was gone, his hoofprints fading in the dry earth, but his presence still lingered in Daniel's mind. Lisa had stayed for a while, watching the fence line, waiting. Mike had left after an hour, shaking his head, convinced the Mustang wouldn't return. But Daniel, he couldn't stop thinking about the way the Mustang had looked back now as the first light of dawn stretched over the horizon. Daniel stood outside, his coffee cooling in his hands. The pasture lay quiet, untouched. No sign of hoofprints, no sign of him. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Guess you made your choice, huh? Lisa's truck rumbled up the driveway. She stepped out, hands in her pockets, eyes scanning the land. Any sign of him? Daniel shook his head. Nothing. She sighed. I don't know why, but I thought he'd come back. Daniel didn't answer. He had thought the same thing. Lisa crossed her arms. It's probably for the best. He belongs out there anyway. Daniel nodded. It was true. The Mustang was born wild. He wasn't meant to be here, so why did it feel like something was missing? The day passed in slow, quiet hours. The ranch chores continued as usual, feeding the cattle, fixing fences, checking on the horses that actually lived there. But his mind kept drifting every time he stepped outside. His eyes flicked toward the Hills every time that the wind shifted he listened hoping for the faint sound of hooves in the distance. Nothing. By late afternoon Lisa had left. Mike had stopped by once only to say told you before. Driving off, Daniel sat on the porch, arms crossed, staring out over the land. It was just another horse, so why couldn't he stop thinking about him? He pushed himself up with a frustrated sigh. Maybe he just needed sleep, maybe this was all. Just then he heard it, a sound so faint he almost thought he imagined it, a soft snort. Daniel froze slowly. Carefully he turned, and there, standing at the edge of the fence line, was the Mustang. His coat gleamed in the setting sun, his powerful frame standing tall. He was free. He could have been miles away, but he had come back. Daniel barely breathed. Well, I'll be damned. The Mustang didn't move, just watched him. Lisa's words from the day before echoed in his mind. Maybe he's curious, maybe he was, or maybe Daniel took a slow step forward. The Mustang didn't run. His ears flicked, his nostrils flared, but he stayed another step still. No movement. Daniel stopped a few feet away, watching the Mustang as closely as he was being watched. A long silence stretched between them, then in a moment that sent a shiver down Daniel's spine, the Mustang took a step forward to a choice, a connection, not as a prisoner, not as a tamed animal, but as something else entirely. The Mustang stood there, his dark eyes locked onto Daniel's. His muscles, once coiled in tension, now seemed to relax just slightly. The wind rustled through the dry grass between them, carrying the scent of open land, of freedom, and yet he had come back. Daniel took a slow breath, keeping his movements steady. He didn't want to spook him. Didn't expect to see you again, he murmured. The Mustang's ears flicked forward. He was listening. Daniel shifted his stance, giving the stallion space, not crowding him. If he wanted to leave, he could. If he wanted to stay, that was up to him. The Mustang took another step forward. Lisa's truck rumbled up the driveway behind them. The sound should have sent the stallion running, but he didn't move. Lisa climbed out slowly, her eyes widening as she spotted the Mustang standing there. No way. Daniel glanced at her, but didn't say a word. The Mustang was choosing to stay. Lisa took a careful step forward. What's he doing? Daniel exhaled. I don't know. Lisa studied the Mustang's posture, his breathing, his ears flicking between them. It's almost like Hune's waiting. Daniel nodded. He could feel it too, but waiting for what? The sun dipped lower, casting golden streaks across the open land. Minutes passed. The Mustang didn't move. He wasn't running, but he wasn't entirely staying either. Lisa crossed her arms. You think he's trying to figure out where he belongs? Daniel's jaw tightened. He had spent his whole life around horses. He had broken colts, worked with stubborn mares, even handled a few wild rescues before, but this was different. This was trust, not forced, not earned through ropes and saddles and fences. Real trust. Daniel took a slow step back, lowering his gaze slightly, giving the Mustang the choice. If you want to go, you can, he said softly. The Mustang stayed. Lisa's breath caught. He's not leaving. Daniel's chest tightened. Maybe he wasn't just looking for freedom anymore. Maybe he was looking for home. The days passed. The Mustang didn't go far. He never let them touch him, never stepped too close, but he stayed. He grazed near the fence line. He lingered by the barn. He watched as Daniel worked, his sharp eyes never missing a movement. He was free. He could leave any time, but he didn't, and little by little he let them in. Lisa was the first one he let stand beside him for longer than a few seconds. Then came Mike, who never admitted he liked the horse, but always checked on him when he thought no one was looking. And then one evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Daniel walked out to check the fence line and found the Mustang waiting for him, not behind the fence, right next to him. No lead rope, no bribes, no tricks, just a man and a wild Mustang standing side by side. Daniel didn't move, didn't speak, and then, in a moment that made his throat tighten, the Mustang lowered his head just slightly, a gesture of trust, a silent understanding. Daniel exhaled slowly, reaching out, not touching, just offering. The Mustang didn't run. He didn't flinch. He just stood there in the open land, where he had once run wild, and now he had chosen to stay, not because he was trapped, not because he was broken, but because finally he had found where he belonged. Some animals choose their own path, some never look back, but every once in a while one makes a choice that changes everything. This Mustang was Meant to be free, but he was also meant to find something more. If this story touched your heart, remember true trust isn't taken, it's given. Make sure to subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who believes in second chances, because sometimes the wildest hearts are the ones that lead us home.